both an honor and a pleasure being here tonight. It's a podium which has seen some of the most distinguished writers transatlantically or from around the world, so I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm grateful to see my folks in the front row to shep a little nachas here tonight. House rules. I'm going to speak for about 43 and a half minutes. At that point, those who want to go out and catch the rest of the Mets game or whatever you need to do, it will not be insulting in the least if you have to leave. For those who came with questions, I will take those questions and answer them for as long as you will ask questions until Bernard will come out again and say, security has asked us to clear the room. So let's just assume at the least 15 or 20 minutes. I know you are not a shy crowd. I have faced some shy crowds. I've been on tour talking about this book, but I know at the Y that is not the problem. And it doesn't only have to be about this book. It could be about anything Shakespeare related on this, the 450th birthday plus one of William Shakespeare, who has been very good to me. And I hope tonight I slightly repay that debt to him. I'm here to talk about a new literary anthology called Shakespeare in America, which I wrote both for and with the extraordinary publishing house, Library of America. My editor, Max Rudin, is in the house tonight. The house lights are up, so I can't point him out. But this kind of work is collaborative. No one puts together a work of 250 years or so of writing by Americans of all stripes. And a number of friends are in the house tonight from whom I've stolen a lot, and I owe a lot. 42 minutes left. The story of Shakespeare and America, when it has been told, which is actually less often than you think, tends to be recounted in one of two ways. The first more or less follows the contours of Benedict and Beatrice's relationship in Much Ado About Nothing, so that in the distant past there was a powerful attraction between Americans and England's national poet. But before anything came of it, they went their separate ways until at last they rediscovered each other and how well matched they really were, and ever since have been inseparable. There's another narrative, best told in Lawrence Levine's really fine book, Highbrow, Lowbrow. It has a less cheerful ending and follows the lines of Milton's Paradise Lost. This one runs, there was a magical moment in mid-19th century America when Shakespeare was widely, almost universally available across the social classes and across the land. Tocqueville's famous remark is usually trotted out at this point that there's hardly a pioneer's hut which does not contain a few odd volumes of Shakespeare. All was going well until, unfortunately, America suddenly split into highbrow and lowbrow cultural groups. And you can actually pinpoint the date at which this happened. The date is May 1849, May 10th, the date of the Astor Place riots. For those of you familiar with that story, and I include that in my anthology, that was a day when working class Americans protesting a highbrow British production of Macbeth decided to trash the Astor Theater, and the authorities fired on them, killing about 20, wounding 100 others, and ruining forever that magical moment of Shakespeare in America. Now, I love both of these versions of how this story has been told, and they have the quality of those Kipling just so stories. But I'm not going to recycle them here, even if I admit to having recycled them in my Columbia classrooms. Because the problem I kept running into over the past few years while putting this anthology together about what Americans have written about Shakespeare is that neither of these narratives accounted for what I kept finding powerful and urgent in so many of the stories and poems and essays. So I'd like to offer up a third, provisional, and competing explanation of how and why Shakespeare has mattered in America. and it runs something like this. There are things that we as Americans tend not to talk about or talk about very well, mostly the things that divide us. Sometimes we don't want to talk about them because we disagree so vehemently when these subjects are raised. Sometimes we don't talk about them because we can't quite articulate our feelings about them. And sometimes we can't talk about them because we're not honest enough to ourselves or with ourselves to admit the ways in which we sometimes believe one thing and say or write something else. My argument then is that American poets and playwrights, novelists and essayists have turned to Shakespeare time and again to try to say what they cannot express any other way quite so clearly or honestly. Shakespeare serves as a touchstone, and we as Americans have looked to his work to test sometimes harsh and sometimes suppressed truths about ourselves. In offering this argument, I'm suggesting that taken together, what American poets and novelists and humorists and essayists have written about Shakespeare over the past 230 years or so offers an alternative, if less soothing or reassuring, version of U.S. history. One other revelation for me in putting this collection together and in steeping myself in the rich body of American creative writing about Shakespeare, much of it obscure, some of it all but unknown, and certainly unknown to me when I began this journey, is that this body of writing offers a different and, to my mind, far richer and more engaging story than a volume of even the best American academic writing about Shakespeare, plays and poems. And to some that may be heresy, but if you finish the anthology and you can imagine putting together an anthology of academic writing that is as good as this, I will refund the cost of your volume. Or Max will. I like to flesh out this argument by offering 3 brief case studies of American writers who have engaged with Shakespeare over the past 150 years or so. The first was America's 6th president. The second, a social and political reformer who was the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And the third, a Japanese-American short story writer who was incarcerated during World War II. The 3 whose works move us westward from Boston to Chicago to Oakland, California, cover a broad geographical range as well. I could have kept this talk or this anthology to Shakespeare in New York. It might have appealed to this audience a little bit more, but I have a feeling that it would have left out a tremendous amount of important writing. I hope through briefly exploring what these 3 individuals have written about Shakespeare to persuade you that Shakespeare has occupied a distinctive place in an America that has long struggled with what divides us, whether the issues are race relations or the industrial workplace or immigration or who counts as one of us, even marriage and the family, issues that continue to perplex and often divide us today. In this sense, Shakespeare remains as necessary and as meaningful to our culture as ever in identifying and perhaps helping us navigate past these cultural divisions. Before turning to these 3 case studies, I'd like to describe first my favorite bit in the whole anthology, a nearly forgotten amateur production that took place over 150 years ago, one that I would have given a lot to have witnessed. It took place in a small trading post in the recently founded community of Corpus Christi, Texas. In January 1846, over half of the United States Army had gathered there, the largest troop concentration since the War of 1812, sent to provoke a war with Mexico after Congress had annexed Texas as a slave state. Such a war, if successful, and it was, would likely lead to the creation of even more slave states. Mexico, at this time, did not allow slavery. This was a controversial military campaign, one that would, opponents warned, lead inexorably to civil war over the question of slavery, though it was viewed by its advocates as part of America's manifest destiny, a phrase that had just been introduced into our national conversation the previous summer. Whatever their views of the politics of their mission, the soldiers sent to Texas had far too much time on their hands while they sat around awaiting orders to cross the Rio Grande and commence hostilities. One of the officers at Corpus Christi at the time described it as, and I'm quoting, the most murderous, thieving, gambling, cutthroat, godforsaken hole in Texas, which I imagine was something. In order to distract the idle troops, Captain John B. Magruder oversaw the building of a playhouse called the Union Theater, large enough to hold 800 spectators. He and the other officers fell to work painting scenery, rehearsing plays, including Shakespeare's Othello. Now, in retrospect, it seems an excruciatingly apt choice, for it was and still is a play that mercilessly explores what it means to be a white woman in love with a black man who himself had been enslaved, a play about the costs of war set in the crossroads of empire. Admission to the Union Theater wasn't cheap. A box seat cost $1, a place in the pit half that, but the productions played to full houses and quickly paid off the cost of the playhouse. A soldier, an officer named Theodoric Porter, was chosen to play the Moor, and James Longstreet, who, like Magruder, later served as a distinguished Confederate general in the Civil War, was initially cast as Desdemona. Now, those of you who are Civil War buffs know that James Longstreet was about my size, clearly wrong for Desdemona. So they looked around and found another young officer who was about 5'7", 135 pounds. He had about a 2-inch beard at the time, but they all did, so they cast him as Desdemona instead. And this lieutenant's name was Ulysses S. Grant. I am not making this up. In later years after the war and after he was defeated, Longstreet, reflecting back on this production, recalled, and I'm quoting because I couldn't make this up, Grant looked very like a girl dressed up. He really rehearsed the part of Desdemona, but he did not have much sentiment. It's great having generals critique each other as theater critics. If Ben Brantley was around then, I can only imagine. Grant apparently didn't shave off his beard. We know this from a letter he wrote to his fiancée Julia a month later. So you'll have to picture him eagerly rehearsing this part. The casting produced one of those strange moments when art imitates life. Because even as Michael Cassio in Shakespeare's play had served as a go-between carrying letters between Desdemona and Othello, so Theodoric Porter had done this for Grant, because Julia's father, like Brabantio in the play, did not approve of her choice of husband. Despite their friendship, in the course of the rehearsals, Porter, who was playing Othello, ended up objecting playing against his friend Grant as Desdemona. He didn't object to him because he wasn't a black man. He objected because Porter said, and this is Longstreet's words, it was bad enough to play the part with a woman in the cast, but he couldn't have pumped up any sentiment for Grant dressed up as Desdemona. So although he had really rehearsed the part and looked good in a dress, Grant was replaced by a professional actress, a woman named Gertrude Hart, who was brought in from New Orleans. Biographical connections to Shakespeare's tragedy shadowed Grant. When, for instance, he had to leave the army in 1854 because he was drunk a lot, a fellow soldier tried to explain to a friend what had happened and compared Grant to Shakespeare's flawed but noble lieutenant in Othello, Michael Cassio. This is what was said about Grant. He took to liquor, not in enormous quantities, but he drank far less than other officers. But like Cassio, he had a poor brain for drinking. The weakness didn't belong to his character, for in all other respects, he was a man of unusual self-control. When you delve around in 19th century America, reading letters and correspondence and the like, it is extraordinary how often people refer to Shakespeare. These are just soldiers writing to each other, and the example they hit upon is Shakespearean and extraordinary. Now, the staging of Othello Corpus Christi, Texas, invites more questions than the few surviving details of this production can begin to answer, not least of which is, why did they stage Othello, of all plays? And since it was Othello, how did this production speak to its time and place? for inevitably they responded to it differently than we might today. Soldiers there might have seen it as a play about military life, including in the Cyprus scenes, soldiers like they themselves with too much time in their hands who are prone to drinking and violence. For these men, both performing and watching Othello, inescapably the play was also about race, and the American soldiers in Corpus Christi were well aware that the decision to send them to Texas to fight, and for a sixth of them, including Theodoric Porter, who played Othello, who was one of the first to die in what Grant later called a wicked and unjust Mexican war, was driven apart by a desire to extend the reach of slavery. Spectators throughout antebellum America, a nation by now hurtling towards civil war, certainly saw Othello through a different lens than, say, British audiences at the time. Parliament had formally abolished slavery in the British Empire in 1833, and black actors, including an American named Ira Aldridge, had been playing Othello on the London stage since 1825. So we can only wonder what effect playing a white woman in love with a black man had, or rehearsing at least, had on the future commander and president of the United States. Now, you would think that a play about a black general eloping with a white woman would have been unpopular, if not taboo, in slave states. But the opposite was true. In the quarter century before the Civil War, Othello was regularly staged in the South, 20 times in Memphis, twice that many in Mobile, Alabama, strong evidence that white Southerners could turn a blind eye towards the play's portrayal of so incendiary an issue as miscegenation. And this was so no matter how light-skinned Othellos were. Shakespeare scholars call this the Bronze Age or Coppertone Age of Othellos. Not too black, not too white, just kind of nicely tanned, which gave a hint of his coloration, but didn't align him with a black Southern slave. As you look around in this period, you will find remarkable Shakespearean bits, like an ad in the South Carolina Gazette for a runaway Negro boy called Othello, who was described as lusty and whose Shakespearean namesake had been sold to slavery. So the ways in which Shakespeare has figured in complicated ways in this country's history has really yet to be untangled. One of the most powerful essays that I've included is by an extraordinary writer, Mary Preston, who was a believer in the Confederacy and wrote a half dozen essays about Shakespeare, all of them through the lens of the South and the lost cause. And she wrote a very powerful essay on Othello, which ends up concluding, Othello was a white man. And you can see in moments like this how powerful the play was to articulate deeper political views. And I always think of her line when I remember what Maya Angelou said over a century later after reading Sonnet 29, Shakespeare was a black woman. In a way, those two remarks bookend American responses. The first of my three case studies is also about Othello, a play that continues to dominate conversations about Shakespeare in this country's history. And the example comes from one of our early presidents, John Quincy Addams, and his essay on the character of Desdemona. He published it in 1835, and it offers maybe the best example in the anthology of a work that complicates well-established and historical narratives of our nation's past. Addams had been born in 1767. He again served as the sixth president of the United States and then as a congressman from Massachusetts. He grew up in a household steeped in Shakespeare. His mom loved to see Shakespeare when she was in London, and years later, Addams recalled that he had been, man and boy, a reader of Shakespeare 80 years, and a pocket edition of Shakespeare's work was on my mother's nursery table. John Quincy Addams' anti-slavery record was matched by very few Americans. He famously attacked slaveholding from the floor of the House of Representatives, successfully defended African Americans before the Supreme Court in the United States versus Amistad, and vocally opposed war with Mexico and the annexation of Texas on the grounds that they would extend the reach of slavery. Addams' credentials as an abolitionist were impeccable, and he hoped to be remembered, in his own words, as the, quote, astutest, acutest, archest enemy of Southern slavery that ever existed. Now, you would think with this track record on slavery, Addams would invoke Othello to offer a staunch defense of the young woman who turned down the curled darlings of her own nation to marry the Moor. It is shocking, then, to turn to his essay and to discover that for Addams, slavery was one thing, sexual relationships, let alone love, between white women and black men, something else entirely. I'll quote. This is what Addams writes. My objections to the character of Desdemona arise not from what Iago or Rodrigo or Brabantio or Othello says of her, but what from she herself does. She absconds from her father's house in the dead of night to marry a blackamoor. She breaks her father's heart and covers his noble house with shame to gratify what? Pure love? Like Juliet or Miranda? No, a natural passion. It cannot be named with delicacy. Her admirers now say this is criticism of 1835, that the color of Othello had nothing to do with the passion of Desdemona. No. Why, if Othello had been white, what need would there have been for her running away with him? She could have made no better match. It gets worse. I'm just giving you the censored bits. What I love about this essay is it captures the contradictions of ostensibly liberal antebellum views of slavery and interracial relations. Follow the logic of his argument, and you are left with a society in which slaves are free, yet not free, to choose who they want to fall in love with or marry. What's so striking is not that Addams could write a piece that reads today as racist and patriarchal in the extreme, rather that he felt compelled to write this because his political arguments didn't capture the complex feelings he had about race, and that writing about Shakespeare provided an acceptable outlet for writing so honestly and self-revealingly, however depressing it is for me to read it aloud today. And it is disheartening reading Addams, especially his conclusion, where he declares that the moral of Othello is that the intermarriage of black and white blood is a violation of the law of nature. That is the lesson to be learned from the play. What I love about this is it was reprinted in 1863 in a volume that an actor named James Hackett gave to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln loved Shakespeare, memorized bits of it, and I'm happy to answer questions about that later, and if not, you can read some of that in the anthology. But I wonder, in the midst of the Civil War, what Lincoln thought reading what his predecessor in the presidency had written about race, a man whose views he must have admired greatly. So this, for me, speaks to the deep contradictions that emerge when you read some very powerful Americans on the subject of Shakespeare. My second case study turns on another great Shakespearean tragedy, King Lear, and it's written by Jane Addams in her groundbreaking essay from 1895 called A Modern Lear. Addams, and it's two Ds and no relation to the presidents, is best remembered today for Hull House in Chicago as a political and social reformer, and again as the first American woman who won the Nobel Peace Prize. She began publishing about Shakespeare as an undergraduate, and it is remarkable how many great American women have begun publishing about Shakespeare as undergraduates. It's a recurrent theme in the book. But even her deep familiarity with the works does little to prepare us, or I should say, did nothing to prepare me for the brilliance of her essay, A Modern Lear, in which she reads Shakespeare's tragedy against the recent and bloody Pullman strike, a national crisis that had far-reaching consequences for American industry, labor, and government. For those who need a very quick refresher on this moment in American corporate history, George Pullman, Pullman cars for the trains in America, had built a company town, which he named creatively Pullman, and he required his workers to live there. And business took a downturn, and he insisted that rents remain the same, even though he had to lay off some of his workers. They thought this was outrageous, and they threatened to strike, and they challenged his authority, and it took a violent turn. The strike only collapsed after President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops. Addams probably finished writing her essay, A Modern Lear, in late 1895, and she began giving it at various women's groups and other groups around the country. In that speech, she drew analogies between King Lear and the tragedy set in motion by the patronizing and patriarchal George Pullman, who so deeply resented the ingratitude of his workers and saw himself as a man more sinned against than sinning, but never came to see, as King Lear did, that he had taken too little care of this. One of the things that makes her essay so fascinating is that Addams came from the same privileged class as Pullman, and he really expected her to side with him. She was also subject on a familial level to a patriarchal Lear-like father who had refused to let her go to the East Coast to go to college. And she was able then to discover in contemporary political events and in Shakespeare both the personal and the political in a way that for me is distinctively American. Addams knew exactly what she was doing, understood that writing about Shakespeare allowed her the necessary distance to write not only about labor relations, but also about her fraught relationship with her own patriarchal and domineering father, who was now dead, or she never would have had the guts to publish this, I don't think. Many other things are path-breaking in her essay as well. One is her emphasis on social justice, epitomized in the play in King Lear's famous speech about how robes and furred gowns hide all, plate sin with gold, and the strong lance of justice hurtless breaks. Over a century after its creation, having broken with kings and lords, America was once again populated with corporate barons, making corrosive social relations in Shakespeare's Lear come into sharper focus. For Jane Addams, the Pullman strike is truly a modern Lear because what she describes as Pullman's feudal virtue, benevolence, is, she writes, too archaic to accomplish anything in Gilded Age America. In a message that has not lost its force over a century later, Addams' Shakespeare in the end becomes a prescription, a warning, especially timely today, for a way forward in American industrial and familial relations. And I'll quote from her. Is it too much to hope that some of us will carefully consider this modern tragedy, if perchance it may contain a warning for the troublous times in which we live? By considering the dramatic failure of the liberal employer's plans for his employees, we may possibly be spared useless industrial tragedies in the uncertain future which lies ahead of us. Pullman heard about her talk on the road and resented it bitterly. And as soon as she tried to publish it in one leading national magazine after another, he picked up the phone or had others do it for him and made sure this could not be published. In fact, it didn't find its way into print until 1912 and was published in a minor journal I've never heard of called The Survey long after Pullman's death. Nonetheless, there were those like John Dewey who called it one of the greatest things I've ever read as to form an ethical philosophy. And I would agree, it's just one of the most powerful essays that I've read about King Lear and about Shakespeare. And I admit that I'd never seen or known of it before I began work putting together and teaching this anthology. My first two case studies touched on struggles in our nation's history that we can't quite seem to get past, and that Shakespeare's works, especially his tragedies, have allowed us to see with unusual clarity. struggles over the desires of the powerful to control the sexual lives and working lives of others. And my final example speaks to an even broader issue that continues to divide this nation of immigrants. Who really is American? And how can Shakespeare help answer that question? Time and again in this melting pot nation, Shakespeare has played a major role in defining both inclusion and exclusion from what it means to be an American. Once again, the usual dividing lines, liberals versus conservatives, Northerners versus Southerners, academics versus farmers, creative types versus reactionaries, get complicated and confounded. I'm thinking especially here of a couple of pieces in the anthology from the late 19th and early 20th century on immigration. One of them is by Henry Cabot Lodge, Bostonian and U.S. Senator, who did his best to impose restrictions on immigration and promote American imperialism, who wrote an essay in 1895 on Shakespeare's Americanism, which is a barely masked argument for keeping immigrants at bay, to keep America Anglo-Saxon and pure, and America using Shakespeare as a stick to hit those who don't fit this model. And there's another one that I've included, the inaugural speech at the Folger Shakespeare Library. I've spent 30 years of my life doing research at that library. I'm a member of its board of governors, but I can't quite get over what was said the day that library opened. And a scholar, Joseph Quincy Addams, no relation to any of the Addamses that I've mentioned so far, gave a talk in front of congressmen, senators, former presidents, and ambassadors, in which he argued that Shakespeare played a crucial role in ensuring a homogeneous nation by retaining a culture that is still essentially English. He said that day, when America seemed destined to become a babel of tongues and cultures, the required teaching of Shakespeare's works in American classrooms combats the force of immigration that had become a menace to the preservation of a long-established English civilization. And it's a long speech and not a very pleasant one. It wasn't only Shakespeare's language that served like the biblical shibboleth, dividing insiders from thick-tongued, uncivilized outsiders, but also who on stage was entitled to speak Shakespeare's words. Charlotte Cushman, a great 19th century actor, fought very hard to play leading male roles, such as Romeo, at the cost of suppressing her sexual identity. And not until 1940s could a black actor, Paul Robeson, finally play the part, an African American, play the part of Othello on the Broadway stage. These struggles over inclusion in American society of lesbians like Cushman, African Americans like Robeson, extend as well to other outsiders. As is well known to so many of you, Jewish immigrants were keenly aware of what it took to fit in this country, and they got the jump on things in part by so fully embracing Shakespeare, not only by raising their children to become Shakespeare scholars, but also, and there are many of us who inhabit those ranks, but also through the Yiddish theater. And those of you old enough to have seen and remembered some of the extraordinary interpretations on the Lower East Side of Shakespeare know exactly what I'm talking about. And there's a lovely piece by Cynthia Ozick near the end of the collection called Actors, which speaks to that long and distinguished tradition. Far less well known, at least in this room, is the struggle for inclusion through Shakespeare of Asian Americans, especially in the fraught 1930s and 40s. I'd like to turn in my final example then to the Japanese-American writer Toshio Mori. Mori was born in California in 1910. He first included a story he titled Japanese Shakespeare in a collection called The Chauvinist and Other Stories that he published in 1979. But he writes at the end of that story parenthetically, or notes, that it had first been published or composed in 1939. I searched forever through 1930s 1939 to find any evidence of the earliest publication of this story and got nowhere. But a little more digging around revealed that the story's publication history, as well as its title, and published in 1979 as Japanese Hamlet, is more complicated. While it may have been written before the attack on Pearl Harbor, as Mori claims, the story, and I'm not so sure of that, the story was only published after the war, most of which Mori, like many other loyal Japanese Americans, had spent incarcerated in the Topaz War Relocation Center in Utah. Now, the leading newspaper of that Japanese American community, it's called the Pacific Citizen, was also published in Utah during the war years. And in a post-war 1946 issue, came out with Mori's story under a different title for really Japanese American readers in English, called Schoolboy Hamlet. For these Japanese American readers in 1946, eager to return to their homes and lives and prove themselves as loyal citizens in the post-war years, a story about a not-so-young man of 31, close enough to the age of Shakespeare's Hamlet, who refuses to grow up in socially acceptable ways and dreams of becoming an actor and playing Shakespeare's greatest role on stage, is aptly named Schoolboy Hamlet. But for the broader American reading public, Mori's later title, when republishing the story, Japanese Hamlet, was more apt. The story then, under these two titles and in quite different publications, speaks to two distinctive audiences in different ways. In the version for broader circulation, the protagonist, Tom Fukunaga, no matter how accomplished a performer of Shakespeare's verse, will always be a Japanese Hamlet. His race, an insuperable impediment to his American dreams, even as his family name, Fukunaga, belies his more Anglo-Saxon given name, Tom. Now, what's so wonderful about this gem of a story, it's only 1,200 words long, is that this glaring truth can never be spoken. Nobody can tell Tom he will never, ever, ever play Hamlet on Broadway. A black man can play Othello, but forget about a Japanese man in the post-war years playing Hamlet on Broadway. And for those of you who are old enough to remember, or those like I did who grew up in the post-war years, remember very well the yellow-skinned, buck-toothed caricature of Japanese prevalent at that time. This was 1946. The protagonist spends his life not taking a job or listening to his uncle, like Hamlet, or his family, but simply reading Shakespeare. And the narrator is initially sympathetic, and he writes or says, "Each time Tom handed me a volume of the complete works of Shakespeare when he came to visit. He never forgot to do that. He wanted me to sit in front of him, open the book, and follow him as he recited his lines. I did willingly. There was little for me to do in the evenings, so when Tom Fukunaga came over, I was ready to help out almost any time. And as his love for Shakespeare's plays grew with the years, he did not want anything else in the world but to be a Shakespeare actor." The painful story turns on the narrator's, spoiler alert, narrator's rejection of Tom's dream. Fed up with listening night after night to Tom read Shakespeare, he finally resolves to tell him the truth, though he's not quite honest enough to spell out what prejudices are responsible for that truth. "I was afraid," he says, "we were not getting anywhere," he tells Tom. "Perhaps we were attempting the impossible and are wasting our lives." "I don't think so," Tom said in response. "I'm improving every day. That's what counts. Our time will come later." That night, we took up Macbeth. He went through his part smoothly. This made him feel good. "Someday, I'll be the ranking Shakespearean actor," he said. Nobody has the courage in the story to tell him there's no way a Japanese man in mid-20th century America is going to be cast in the iconic role of Hamlet, not even at a time when African Americans could play Othello or other roles. I'll read from the story's end so that you get a sense of the subtlety of this simple and powerful story. "Tom did not come to the house again. I guess it got so that Tom couldn't stand me any more than his uncles and parents. When he quit coming, I felt bad. I knew he'd never abandon his ambition. I was equally sure that Tom would never rank with the greatest Shakespearean actors, but I could not forget his simple persistence. One day, years later, I saw him on the Piedmont car at 14th and Broadway. He was sitting with his head buried in a book, and I was sure it was a copy of Shakespeare. For a moment, he looked up and stared at me as if I were a stranger. Then his face broke into a smile, and he raised his hand, and I waved back eagerly. "How are you, Tom?" I shouted. He waved his hand politely again, but did not get off, and the car started up Broadway, end quote. This street name is perfectly chosen, for that's the only Broadway where this Asian-American lover of Shakespeare will ever get to recite Hamlet's words. And of course, Shakespeare stands in for the dominant literary culture that Toshio Mori himself, though born here, struggled with only partial success to enter. I'll conclude. It took Shakespeare to give the struggle of Toshio Mori's protagonist a local habitation and a name. The same holds true, I came to discover, in the act of putting together this anthology, when American authors grappled with flying bombers in Vietnam, or facing the drudgery of the daily suburban commute, or staring at the ruins of the Twin Towers. I hope through the examples that I've offered tonight to have given you some sense of why Shakespeare not only continues to speak to us in America, but how also we struggle to speak through Shakespeare to each other. Thank you. At this point, I am going to take your questions, and this is what I'm going to ask. Ask as a question rather than as a statement, because if you give it as a statement, I'll turn it into a question I would prefer to have answered. And just stand. And for the rest of you, since this is being recorded, I will repeat the question and simplify it so that I can answer it more easily. Fire away. Who's first? I know you're not shy. Let it never be said that no one raised a hand. Where? Stand up, please. Sir.
There's a subset of Shakespeare's plays that are most popular, most common today. Would the subset 100 years ago or 200 years ago have been the same?
That's a great question. The question is, and I'll just change it slightly. Shakespeare wrote 35 to 40 plays, a couple of which don't survive. But we never see King John or 2 Henry VI. It's always a mini canon. If you went to the Royal Shakespeare Company's main stage in Stratford, you would know that the same 15 kept getting recycled. So the question is, what is the mini canon, the subset of Shakespeare's plays that have preoccupied Americans, and have they changed over time? Is that a fair characterization of the question? And were they different from the ones that were popular in England? That's a great little codicil to that question. There are a half dozen plays that seemed to usually preoccupy America in the 19th century and into the 20th century. And they tend to be Othello, they tend to be the tragedies. Othello, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth. Those were all plays, obviously, very popular in Britain as well. Richard III was also extremely popular and still is in this country, as Al Pacino and Kevin Spacey and television series made out of Richard III made clear to you. But the other histories have never really had legs in this country. You won't see an awful lot in the 19th century of Richard II. You won't see the first cycle of history plays, the Henry VI plays. You won't see a lot of the comedies like Merry Wives of Windsor, plays that did better in the UK. I think plays that spoke, in a word, to Englishness. I don't think that Henry V really had a presence in this country until Laurence Olivier's version of it in the 1940s, when a film was made of it, and then it caught on, especially as an anti-war play in the 60s. So one of the things that's really fun for me to track is not only which plays move in and out of the canon of American Shakespeare in relationship to English Shakespeare, but also the interpretations of those plays, how they flip one way or another in circumstances that are different than British ones. They always deal with our own political circumstances. And Othello is the most written about play by creative writers in America without question. Next.
I have a question.
Please.
First of all, thank you very much for an extremely rewarding and valuable talk. What is your opinion, because I'm directing it this summer, of Taming of the Shrew?
I love Taming of the Shrew. And if you didn't hear that question, fix your hearing aids, because that is somebody from the theater who knows how to project. No mic. Taming of the Shrew is one of those plays that became popular in mid-20th century America. And I'm thinking there's a lovely illustration I have in the volume. It's one of my favorite ones of Patricia Morrison as Kate on Broadway in 1948. Who here saw that production? There have to be a couple. There are always people. I could ask who saw the original Hamlet, and in this none. I shouldn't say that. One of the great things about speaking in New York is who saw Orson Welles' Julius Caesar. Anybody here who's seen that? I've had people at BAM who've raised their hands. I mean, people have seen stuff that I would have killed to have seen. Kiss Me, Kate is the wonderful catalyst, I think, for interest in this play in America. And I think since the 60s, since we've begun to have more open warfare over the relationship between men and women, before that it was more, let's just say, subterranean, that play has risen in popularity. I think the example of Kiss Me, Kate is a particularly American, this is not answering your question exactly, but there are things that Americans have done with Shakespeare. Boys from Syracuse, Kiss Me, Kate, West Side Story, which originally was about intermarriage, but then they realized, passé, let's do something a little trendier, and it would have died on the vine, I think, had they made it about East Side, West Side, Jewish, Christian relations. But I think the American musical has captured something about Shakespeare that the British have never figured out. So it's this joining of American popular form with these warhorse plays in innovative ways that I think is one of America's greatest contributions to Shakespeare. I love that play. A lot of people don't like teaching it. It is a great play, and it always tells us, like the proverbial canary in the coal mine, where things stand in our cultural moment. Next question. Please, sir.
Would you care to comment on the article in the New Yorker this week?
That question's a plant. I asked that gentleman to ask me if I would care to comment upon Adam Gopnik's story about the beehive. And just show of hands, whose New Yorker has been delivered already and who's still waiting later in the week. Happy to answer that question. And I know something of the backstory, and I've read much of, if not most of, the book that accompanies that story. My mom always told me, if something is too good to be true, it's not true. Thank you, Mom. You were right, and that obtains as well, sadly, for this, even if those booksellers are in the house. Let me give you the minute 30-second version instead of having Bernard invite me back just to answer this question. For those of you who are not familiar with what the question was about, a couple of really distinguished booksellers in New York picked up a volume on eBay of a dictionary from Shakespeare's day that scholars know was one of those dictionaries that Shakespeare made use of. And it contains lots of underlinings and some other kind of scribblings in it. And they bought it for about $4,000 and either came to discover or more likely persuaded themselves, even though his name was not on this, that this was Shakespeare's own copy of this dictionary. There are three obstacles that stand in the way of that claim from my perspective. One is Shakespeare, from every scrap of writing we have, whether it's his signatures or the handee of a play called Thomas More, wrote in secretary hand rather than in italic. This is in italic. And that suggests that it was written by somebody a little younger than Shakespeare when the move away from secretary to italic became more frequent. But the handwriting stuff is so tenuous in any case because we don't have enough of Shakespeare's handwriting. The next argument is that the incredibly unusual words that appear in this appear in Shakespeare. And if you spend enough time doing that kind of, here's Shakespeare's concordance, here's this underlined word, you can find incredible correspondences, which is exactly what I discovered when people were arguing that Francis Bacon or the Earl of Oxford or my mom and dad wrote Shakespeare's work, and I wrote about that in Contested Will. The problem with this enterprise is there are databases that Shakespeare scholars now have called EBO, Early English Book Online, which with 2 clicks can tell you that that word that only appears once in Shakespeare appears 9 times in Thomas Nash, 15 times in Marlowe, 22 times in Chapman, and is more likely to be by somebody else than by Shakespeare. So far as I could tell, and so far as I told the people at New Yorker who asked me about this, they are unaware of these incredible search engines, which would have, I think, dampened their claim. I think they weren't aware. If they were aware and didn't mention it, that is slightly more disturbing. Look, we all want to find a book in a bookstore that was owned by William Shakespeare so we can buy the last $1 million 2-bedroom in Manhattan. Ain't gonna happen. Next question. There are no miracles and there are no $1 million properties. Next question. In the back, please. Stand in the left.
What age do you think children should start reading Shakespeare, and what would the first play be if you feel that?
What age should children start reading Shakespeare, and what play should that be? I'm going to answer in a roundabout way. I just finished a documentary on John Webster and the Duchess of Malfi for BBC Two that's going to air next month there, but never here because PBS doesn't think we understand John Webster or the Duchess of Malfi. If you remember Shakespeare in Love, which, by the way, is going to open as a play in London in July, book your tickets before it sells out, directed by Declan Donnellan, the brilliant man behind Cheek by Jowl. If you remember the film Shakespeare in Love, there was a little John Webster who held up a mouse and fed it to a cat and told Shakespeare how much he loved Titus Andronicus. If you want your child to grow up and write Duchess of Malfi and other dark, tragic comedies, have them start with Titus Andronicus. If, on the other hand, you want them to get into Columbia and study with me, I would prefer you start them with the mini canon of American plays that we talked about before. I think, and not only do I think, I've tried to put into practice the belief that kids who are 10 years old, and not just kids who go to privileged schools, should be should be acting out Shakespeare. And there's a real difference. If you are acting out Shakespeare, you are coming to it in a visceral way. If you are reading the play, as I did in Midwood High School in the late 1960s, you will learn to hate Shakespeare. I hated Shakespeare. I never took Shakespeare when I was an undergraduate. I never even took a Shakespeare course as a graduate student because the experience of sitting in rows like this and reading it aloud and not getting the dirty bits that everybody else seemed to get was a numbing, depressing experience that made me feel dumb. My own experience of Shakespeare was gained taking cheap Freddie Laker flights to London in the 70s. You could fly over for $100, sleep in church basements or youth hostels, and see a play a day for 50 pence or $1. And I would hold down a lousy job as a street messenger or selling stuff at South Street Seaport for June and July. And in August, I would go over for 3 weeks every year and see 20 or 25 plays. And after about 10 years, I'd seen some of the greatest actors in the greatest plays of Shakespeare, and I almost only saw Shakespeare. And I realized that I was lucky to have experienced Shakespeare as a theatrical rather than as a reading experience. I've always used my own child as a Pavlovian experiment. And one of the experiments that I've done with him is to barge into his classroom in the 4th grade at the School of Columbia and said, I want to see if these kids can learn Romeo and Juliet. And instead of teaching the whole play, which is mistakenly done, I just said, let's just take 150 lines. Act 3, Scene 1, the fight scene. And there are only 3 rules for introducing Shakespeare into a classroom of 10-year-olds. Everybody gets a weapon. The weapons aren't sharp. And the person who memorizes the role gets to play the part. So that we had a female Mercutio, a girl playing Benvolio, a girl playing Romeo. They memorized the parts. The boys just wanted weapons. And as it turned out, it was an interesting experiment because half the school at Columbia was for faculty brats like my kid, and half was for neighborhood kids, the school's euphemism for lower income kids that Columbia was busily displacing in this neighborhood and wanted to pay reparations by letting them study. And I went in the first day and took the opening sonnet of Romeo and Juliet, 2 households both alike in dignity. And there were 14 kids in the class. I cut the sonnet up into 14 strips, threw it in a sock, had each kid pull out a line just to see if they could memorize one line. There were 3 kids in that classroom who could not read that line of Shakespeare. And I realized this could be a big mistake. 4 weeks later, having elbowed my son's teacher out of the classroom, or at least into the corner, and taken over, every kid in that room knew every part, knew the whole scene by heart, and they were putting on fantastic, fantastic Shakespeare. They owned that scene. You teach one scene, you could teach 2, you could teach acts and the whole play. That is the way to do it, 10 years old. And again, would I go back and do Titus? Only if I wanted to really mess with some kids' heads. Doesn't make a difference. I wouldn't start with Shrew necessarily, but plays like Julius Caesar or Midsummer Night's Dream are really, really wonderful choices. But you have to have them acted out, and you have to have weapons. You know, I'm sorry you didn't tell me that when I was writing my preface, or I would have used that line. Finish the question, I'll repeat it. That's a great question. Shakespeare and the American novel. And the great quote that, if some of you didn't hear, was Hemingway said that the American novel comes from Twain and Huck Finn, and if you look at Huck Finn comes from Shakespeare. And that's not, in a sense, untrue. Mark Twain figures largely in this collection as a kind of seminal American figure who understood how to both appropriate Shakespeare and push off of Shakespeare. American novelists, especially in the 19th century, were extraordinary readers of Shakespeare. Melville was so deeply engaged with reading Shakespeare's works while he was writing Moby Dick that I would have loved to have included Moby Dick in this anthology, but Max said the font wasn't invented that was small enough that would have allowed us to have put this inside these covers. Again and again in the 19th and into the early 20th century, it's very hard to find American novelists who didn't engage with Shakespeare. Probably the best literary essay or piece of writing in this is a Henry James story called The Birthplace. Henry James, obviously, before he turned tail and ran away to Europe, was an American and steeped in American culture, and like Twain, skeptical that Shakespeare had indeed written the works attributed to him. But these are writers who really, really wrestle with Shakespeare. Willa Cather, who you think of as Midwestern and not saturated in the New York theatrical culture, has terrific stuff early on in her career, included in the anthology on Shakespeare. Cynthia Ozick is another example. Joyce Carol Oates, I almost included but didn't have room for, a wonderful essay of hers that riffs on Shakespeare. So I would say that the mainstream, and if Mr. Roth were here, I would say that Philip Roth's novels are also inflected by it. I don't think literature in the last 10 or 15 years is as marked by Shakespeare, because there's so many rivulets and streams now feeding into the literary culture that Shakespeare no longer has the same cultural presence and pressure, certainly in the Iowa workshop world, as he might have in the world of Twain and Hawthorne and Melville and other writers at that time. It was really hard for me to exclude the novel from this, simply because novels that engage in Shakespeare are too big to include. But I would have loved to have done that. Please.
How important was the teaching of Shakespeare during the 19th century in the schools?
That is a great question. How important was Shakespeare in the teaching of the schools in the 19th century? In other words, it doesn't come out of nowhere that all these novelists and poets and Civil War soldiers are somehow speaking of Shakespeare so readily. There was something called the McGuffrey Reader. And the McGuffrey Reader was designed by a man named William McGuffrey, who died in 1873. By the time he died in that year, there were 47 million copies of his reader, which included lots of Shakespeare to be recited. For all of those in the room who grew up some decades ago reciting The Quality of Mercy is Not Strained, or To Be or Not to Be, or like Abe Lincoln reciting these long speeches, McGuffrey's reader was critical. I said that 47 million were circulated by his death in 1873. By 1922, that figure had risen to 122 million. So that was how Shakespeare circulated through the veins of American culture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
How was it taught?
Probably with a ruler.
Speaking of $1 million apartments and lots of money and lots of people on money, about Lincoln, what amazed you about what Lincoln, his engagement with Shakespeare? And then on a kind of, I guess, smaller, maybe less consequential note, when New York went from being the British headquarters during the Revolution to being the place of the first sort of White House, and Washington being a prominent and sort of loved to go to the theater. Was there a shift in the canon in that moment?
There are 3 or 4 really complicated questions in that. So I'm going to turn it into a simpler question and urge you to read my introduction, which will answer those questions, but which would bore most people. I'm going to turn it into a question about American presidents and Shakespeare, which I've given some thought to, not just because Addams is in here, or his father, Addams, along with Jefferson, visited Stratford-upon-Avon, and talk about buying something that has Shakespeare's mark on it. The first president, Addams, came home from Stratford-upon-Avon with a piece of a chair that belonged to Shakespeare. And you know, somewhere in Stratford was a small factory manufacturing chairs that belonged to Shakespeare. So from the earliest, from Washington, who, as you rightly say, saw Shakespeare on stage, through Lincoln, whose interest in Shakespeare was not what you would expect. When he was sitting for a portrait and bored, his portrait painter recorded, he didn't recite To Be or Not to Be. He recited, and this is during the war years, Claudius's guilty speech in Hamlet and speeches from Richard III. I think that just says so much about the man. And what he really didn't like was the way in which contemporary actors were cutting these speeches from the original. He was a real text guy when it came to Shakespeare. Truman and Eisenhower, both in high school, engaged in productions of or essays on the Merchant of Venice. I mean, just think of how that influenced their attitude towards Jews and the state of Israel. Bill Clinton wrote a very elegant foreword to my volume, and I thank the editors at the Library of America for persuading him to do that. Those of you who remember Yitzhak Rabin's funeral, where he quoted from Shakespeare, and his other comments about his interest in Macbeth and ambition. The truth is, presidents are under enormous pressure most every day they're in office. And I think their interest in Shakespeare probably derives from the fact that no writer has described characters who are under unbearable pressure to the breaking point and sometimes beyond, as well as Shakespeare. And if they want to find some kind of correlative to their own daily experience, I don't think they had to look much further than Shakespeare. I would love to know whether Obama has an edition of Shakespeare in the White House and whether he opens and reads it. One day I hope to ask him that question. If you have to leave, it's not a song. More, come on. It's the 92nd Street White House. Yes.
Columbia University, I understand, has a core curriculum, Shakespeare part of it. Would you say a little bit how it became part of it, the curriculum, and how would you change it?
Core curriculum created in the early 20th century to acculturate people like my ancestors who didn't quite have the right WASPy values. It's done a great job over the last century. We still teach Shakespeare in the core. They teach King Lear. The question was asked earlier, what plays would you start kids with? I wouldn't teach King Lear to college students. In truth, it is lost on the young. I would teach a play like Hamlet, or I would actually teach a play like Troilus and Cressida, which revisits the earlier great works. The great books course, for some of you who have some familiarity with it at Columbia, is Homer through Virginia Woolf, basically. So Shakespeare is in conversation with so many of those writers, including Cervantes, whose plot he stole in his late play, Cardenio. Let me take two more questions. Yes, please.
You described the numbing effect that Shakespeare had for you in school trying to read it, and then you described when you were traveling on these flights to England, sleeping in cellars in order to see this, but you didn't really explain the transformative moment.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Mom, Dad, cover your ears. I would take drugs in those days, but no drug was as powerful as Shakespeare. And for some people, it's a gateway drug. They go on to read Melville or, Woolf. But I have always been loyal to the first drug and have built up some kind of ability to ingest large chunks of Shakespeare. It was just a drug. It was an experience. And I'll tell you an anecdote. No, I didn't read the plays. I just going to see the plays. Look, my son had difficulties, so his first grade teacher said, paying attention in class. And I said, he's only having difficulty paying attention because he's clearly bored in your classroom. And it got ugly. And I decided to prove my case by bringing him on my next trip to London. I'm on the board of the Royal Shakespeare Company and just dragged him along. He was 5, and I thought, I'm going to take him to see a production of Midsummer Night's Dream. It's 3 hours long. We'll see if he can pay attention for 3 hours. Front row seats at the West End Theater. I didn't realize he was about this low relative to the stage. Borrowed some coats, propped him up. And it was like watching a kid on acid. He was just transfixed. And when Puck threw fairy dust, He was shocked nobody else in the audience was picking it up. He was stuffing his pockets with fairy dust. And he knows Shakespeare now as an actor. He is much better at it than I, in a kind of living, breathing, performative way. I can't seem to memorize 3 lines strung together. But it was fun seeing my son addicted to the same drug as I had been 20 years earlier. I'm going to end not with a question, but I will ask the question and then answer it, which is easier, really, in truth. The question is, what Shakespeare in New York City has moved or changed you the most in recent history? And I'm happy to answer that question. Last winter, I'm involved with advising productions at the Public Theater, and the Public Theater put together a team of 8 actors and a terrific director to take a stripped-down 90-minute version of a play, Much Ado About Nothing in this case, which I helped them edit down and work up. And then they took it to 20 venues in and around New York, none of which most of you have been in, by which I mean Rikers and other prisons and halfway houses. And we took Much Ado into Rikers, and it was in a room not much smaller or larger than this, and it was set up in a small square around a piece of green astroturf that was the stage. And the inmates filed in an hour early to watch this, and they sat just excited. And they asked 2 questions before the production began. One, how many plays Shakespeare had written, and I said about 40 or so maybe. And the other, is he still alive? And I said no. And then this production began. And we are all overeducated Shakespeare viewers. There's no way anybody would show up here unless they had a deep and abiding love of Shakespeare. These were people who had never seen Shakespeare and may never see Shakespeare again. And they also didn't understand how to behave in a theater, by which I mean neither did they unwrap candies or listen to their cell phones. They didn't have candies or cell phones. It was terrific to be in a theater space which had neither of those. But they didn't understand that they weren't supposed to be quiet. So when Hero collapsed, 6 of the men jumped up. She's down, to help her up. Or when Claudio doesn't pick a fight with his future father-in-law, and backs away from it. The chorus of, "Pussy, what's your problem?" was unbelievable. And I felt for the first time what it must have been like to see a play in 1600. So great things are going on all around us. I'm happy to share a little bit of it tonight. I'm happy to sign copies of this outside. Thank you so much for coming in tonight.